Yesterday, the ANC launched the Cuban Solidarity Campaign. The campaign is intended to coincide with the 61st anniversary of the Cuban Revolution, and that's tomorrow. It aims to celebrate the long-standing relationship that the organization has with the Communist Party of Cuba and 20 years of South Africa-Cuba diplomatic relations. To tell us more, we are joined in studio by His Excellency Ambassador Carlos Fernandos de Corsia. I hope I've got that right, from the Cuban Embassy.
Right.
It's good to have you, Ambassador. Thank you for popping in, coming to chat to us. Thank you. The history between the ANC and Cuba goes back many, many years. Just talk to us about it.
It goes back to the beginning of the 1960s, to the beginning of the Cuban Revolution. Cuba was an early supporter of the struggle against segregation and apartheid in South Africa. And as far back as 1962, young South Africans went to Cuba to train as professionals in the medical sector and engineering. And Cuba also gave early military support, material support for the struggle. Cuba also had close contacts with the ANC, with the South African Communist Party from the beginning of the 1960s. And we trained people militarily.
Yeah.
And also Cuba was involved in the war in Southern Africa, in Southern Angola, which helped to defeat the apartheid military machinery.
Yeah, I mean, look at these visuals. I was talking to you more fair about these amazing visuals that we have of Fidel Castro alongside all of our African leaders, and just you can see that the camaraderie that existed in those days.
That's true.
Yeah.
And our involvement with Africa was very early.
Yeah.
In Cuba, we believe that we're indebted to Africa because part of our population has ancestors in Africa.
Yeah. Now, one of the aims of the Solidarity Campaign is to celebrate that long-standing relationship between, obviously, the Communist Party of Cuba and the 20 years of South Africa-Cuba diplomatic relations. What are some of the planned events? What's going to happen?
Well, there was a lecture yesterday organized by Mistra at Joburg University. There was a film screening of the film Mandela and Fidel last night. There's going to be some more film screening next week, and on the 9th of August, there's going to be what we call a Cuba Cafe, organized by the ANC and the Alliance in general, which is a way of having a Cuban night together with South African friends here in Johannesburg.
Yeah. Now, when we look at the relationship, the 20 years of diplomacy between South Africa and Cuba, how have the countries benefited?
Both countries benefit, first because there's a very good sentiment between people. We have strong cooperation in the medical service, in training, in education. We're trying to expand trade. We believe that there's complementarity between the two countries, and there's a lot of identification in the international arena. There's a very common ground, a common mind between Cuba and South Africa on issues of importance like Palestine, like Western Sahara, and South Africa has a strong position of solidarity with Cuba against the U.S. economic blockade and for the liberation of the Cuban Five, which are imprisoned in the U.S.
Yeah, yeah. We look at the anniversary. I mean, you've spoken to us what's going to be happening here in South Africa, but I can only imagine in Cuba there are going to be massive celebrations taking place.
There have been celebrations. There have been several. We had on last Saturday we had a marathon on Mandela Day, and it was part of the celebrations of the 20th anniversary. It was a marathon in Havana. We canceled a specific stamp on the bilateral relations between Cuba and South Africa, and there have been rallies. We suspect there's going to be some we know there are going to be some cultural events in the second half of the year, literature, and the launch of a book by Father Michael Lapsey, his book about his life. And he's been a good friend of Cuba, and it's one of the interesting things for the people of Cuba.
Yeah. The presidency under the rule of Raúl Castro, how is it going in Cuba?
It's going well, and he's been leading an important process of transformations in Cuba, looking above all to increase the efficiency of the country, to adapt the country for greater sustainability in the future, taking into account the challenges that the country faces, a small, underdeveloped country with lack of resources and with a great hostility coming from the U.S., economically basically. And the important process of transformation has been carried out with the push of the people and the support of the people, and it's going well.
One of the biggest moments that stood out, I think, between the relationship between the US and Cuba was here in South Africa, where we saw the handshake, that momentous handshake at the memorial of our former President Nelson Mandela between the American and the Cuban presidents. Whatever happened after that? I mean, is there any possibility of sanctions ending?
The possibility is there. The majority of the US population, according to polls, supports a change in policy. The majority of the Cuban population living in the U.S. supports a change of policy, and the Latin American population. Most American politicians, before they enter government and after they leave, they all criticize the current situation. So there should be a possibility. It hasn't been shown by the U.S. government, and today there still is a policy of hostility towards Cuba, against the country of Cuba. Perhaps a handshake said more about South Africa than about the relationship.
Yeah, yeah. And about Madiba.
That's right.
Yeah, I think that was the headlines of the only man that could bring them together. And we saw that relationship that he did have with Cuba and Fidel Castro. Is there a website that people can visit? I mean, you mentioned some of these activities taking place, that people can go out there and see where they're taking place and get involved in South Africa. It's
the website of the South African Embassy in Havana.
Okay.
The website of it's called Cuba Minrex, which is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Cuba.
Okay.
And the whole program here in South Africa is going to be presented on the embassies, which is Embassy of Cuba. Excellent.
So if you can just Google the Embassy of South Africa, the Embassy of Cuba here in South Africa's website, you'll be able to find the entire a program of events, and you can join in. Ambassador, thank you for joining us. Thank you for coming to talk to us. His Excellency Carlos Fernandos de Cosio, who is the Cuban ambassador to South Africa. Right, the time, 23 minutes past 7. It's time for your sports news. Here's Vela.